Okay, so welcome back to PS414. So last week we talked about how people recognise objects and really how well people recognise objects given how difficult the problem is, given how objects can be seen in all different sorts of illumination, in different positions, in different angles, and yet we're able to extract that information, we're able to take the visual stuff out there, interpret it in a way that allows us to recognise all the different things that we can in our environment. Today we're going to kind of carry on looking at that, but we're going to look at what's really a special class of objects. That's the human face. So we're going to look at how we recognise human faces and how we do it quite as well as we do. We're really expert at recognising faces. So again, we can think about how do we take that visual information and how do we transform it into a form which allows us to put a name to a face and to do all the other clever things that we can do with faces. So I'm going to start off again by just sort of pointing out that it's a hard problem. Face recognition is a hard problem, and it's a clever thing that we do. If you think about all the different types of faces that you can recognise and all the different types of information that you can get from a face, you kind of start to appreciate how well we can do face recognition. So you can look at a face and you can find out its identity. So you can look at this sort of set of all these different types of faces and you'll be able to recognise some of those people. You can tell things about their age, about their gender. You can tell me what they do for a living. You might be able to tell me whether they were healthy or unhealthy. You might be able to tell me something about their politics or their friendship, their age. You can detect faces even in very simple representations like a smiley or in an object which is not really a face at all but which has a configuration of features that looks face-like. So we can take all this sort of different information and we can get a lot out of faces. And yet it's a hard problem because all these faces have very similar features. There's no sort of one thing that says, oh, that's David Beckham or that's Harrison Ford. There's no one sort of thing that you can spot. It's quite a subtle difference between all these faces, and yet we're able to do it very easily and very effortlessly. And again, we can think about the sort of the processes that you might have to go through and the reason that this is kind of an interesting thing to study in terms of computer recognition, in terms of teaching computers how to recognise faces. This is a big area of research. It's something that Facebook and Google would really like to crack, automatically tagging people in photographs. And there's been quite a lot of progress, but still they're nowhere near as good as you or I are at recognising our friends, even if they've changed their haircut or they're wearing a different pair of glasses. So we're really good at recognising faces, and we want to know why is that and how do we go about doing that. So I was thinking about face recognition being a hard problem, and I was thinking about this game, Guess Who. You probably remember this game where you have to pick a person at random and then you have to sort of guess what card the other person is holding. And you do that by sort of eliminating the different facial features. These are sort of caricatures where they've got big noses and big glasses and huge moustaches and that kind of thing. But in real life, again, the subtle distinction between faces is something which is very small. It's not like other objects where you can say a chair has 4 legs and a seat, whereas maybe a stool has a slightly different set of features. Faces differ in very subtle ways. We all have noses, we all have eyes, we all have hair. The features, there are no sort of diagnostic features which you can immediately say, ah, that's that person. So the sorts of the features that we must be sort of detecting are very subtle. So unlike most object recognition problems, where we're sort of recognizing a class of objects, chairs versus umbrellas, recognizing a particular individual's face involves a very subtle distinction between items, and between items which contain the same features. So as I said, we all have eyes, noses, mouths, but something about the relationship between those features, even though it's subtle, allows us to recognize a particular person. So I could show you a face like that, and I could say, who's that? Can anybody recognize who that is? Somebody said something out there. Somebody said Julia Roberts. Anybody else? Somebody said Demi Moore. You're quite right. What it actually is a morph between the two. So this is taken from a piece of research where they basically took a photo of Demi Moore on one end and a photo of Julia Roberts, and they've morphed between the two. So they've kind of combined the features progressively. So the first image I showed you was actually halfway between Demi Moore and Julia Roberts. But I think it quite nicely illustrates that the change between those individuals is very subtle. And a couple of people picked up on it, even though maybe it's not presented very clearly on this screen. So you can change a very, very small amount between one end, and yet we can kind of flip between who we're recognizing. And what they found in this study was that actually you can sort of adapt to seeing Demi Moore. So if we show you lots of pictures of Demi Moore and then we suddenly show you one of these, you see it's more like Julia Roberts than if we do it the other way around. So we can sort of adapt to the right features of a particular individual. So face recognition is a hard problem because it involves very subtle differences in facial features. So it may be, this is our first hint that something very different is happening in face recognition compared to the sort of the general object recognition that we were talking about last week. So I'm going to talk about 4 different sorts of areas, or 4 different sorts of pieces of evidence about faces and about the sorts of research that we do with faces. I'm going to start off by talking about experiments that show faces are different from other sorts of objects, and that talk about what is it about face recognition which is different? Can we sort of describe that in a bit more detail? So there are several different experimental effects which show how people treat faces differently. Then I'm going to talk about a sort of a cognitive model of how people recognize faces, how people go from the facial features to something like a name. And this is a kind of a structural model, a bit like the models of object recognition that we talked about last week. And then after the break, I'm going to talk about some neuropsychological evidence about prosopagnosia, where people lose the ability to recognize faces, and some other evidence from neuroscience that maybe shows that we have a specialized brain mechanism for detecting faces, and that might be why we're so good at it. So I'm going to talk about several different effects that show that the way we treat faces seems to be slightly different from the way we treat normal objects. And a lot of these effects, the logic is kind of the same, and it's what we might call a functional dissociation. And what that means is that we can do something to a picture of a face, we can manipulate it in some way, and we can look at what's the effect of that on our recognition, on our ability to recognize faces. And if we show that that has a particular effect on our face recognition, as in the top graph, but it doesn't affect how we recognize other objects, or it doesn't affect them to the same degree, then we can have some sort of evidence and a suggestion that there's something different going on, and that the processes that we go by to recognize a face are different from the ones that we're going by to recognize a class of objects which is not affected. So you can kind of think of this as a general sort of experimental logic. We might have a control sort of category, and we might have our faces, and we might say, here's something which affects faces, doesn't affect objects, and therefore we can start to make some conclusions about what's the different sorts of processing that's going on that makes faces special. So we can kind of keep that in mind with all these effects. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the face inversion effect. And it's been known for quite a long time that faces are particularly affected by inversion, by turning them upside down. So you probably all easily recognize the music baron Simon Cowell on the left, but you might find it a bit more difficult to recognize the picture on the right. Do you all know who it is? A couple of people inverting their heads. It's Hasselhoff. So what was found in 1969, and which has been shown many times over, is that faces, inverting faces, makes them unusually difficult to recognize. So if you invert something which isn't a face, and other sorts of object, you might be a little bit slower. But if you invert a face, you're really much slower. So something disproportionate happens when you turn something upside down, which is a face, and which sort of disrupts the relationships between the features. So I'm going to show you quite a few other examples of that. And we can start to think about why would that be the case and what does it show us? If you think about what you might be doing with objects, the sorts of processes we talked about last week, where you're sort of taking the different components, you're assembling them together, you should be able to do all of that even if we turn it upside down. So those sorts of models wouldn't predict a dramatic effect of inverting the stimulus. So the fact that you do get an effect suggests that there's something else going on in faces, something else we're doing, rather than just kind of putting those components together in a sort of a piecemeal way. So, as I said, it disproportionately affects faces. So if you look at another class of objects, you don't have any difficulty recognizing that that's a chair, even though it's upside down, even though you never see chairs upside down, and you've never seen that particular chair upside down. You can still recognize it as a chair. Whereas with faces, it's a lot more difficult. So the face inversion effects kind of relates to another nice perceptual illusion called the Thatcher illusion, which was proposed by Peter Thomson. So Peter Thomson was a vision scientist, didn't really know all that much about faces, but he stumbled across this effect, and it's not something which is completely understood even today, but it shows that something different happens when you turn a face upside down. So what Thomson did was he turned a photo of Margaret Thatcher upside down and he manipulated it. So we've got a different copy of it upside down. And then he showed two inverted faces upside down. And all you have to do is sort of spot the difference between these and spot what's wrong with these faces, or what's wrong with one of these faces. So I've done something to one of these faces. Can anybody spot which one it is? It's this one. Do you know what it is that's wrong with it? Yeah, so some people have spotted that there's something going on with the eyes, something's changed. It's quite a subtle difference, and you can't see a huge difference. But when I turn it the right way up, it will jump out at you, and you'll see it very easily. Okay? So when we turn it the right way up, it's obvious that something weird is going on with Margaret Thatcher's face. We've turned the features upside down. We've turned the mouth and the eyes upside down. When we look at it the right way up, it's obvious, it's very clear, there's something weird going on. When we look at it upside down, it's much less obvious. So this again shows that not only are we worse recognizing faces when they're upside down, something different's going on. We're following some different kind of processing, which is not picking up on these features in the same way. Here's another example. One of these faces has been Thatcherized, as they say. Can you tell which one it is? Got some votes for left. It is the left one, I believe. Let's flip it up again. So again, we've just vertically flipped the features, vertically flipped the eyes and the mouth around. And it's obvious when you look at it from the right way up, but when we invert it, it's less obvious. And this, I think, is one of the authors of this Mora et al. Review paper, which is quite a nice general review about some of these effects that I'm going to be talking about. So that's face inversion. That's what happens when we turn around a photograph which is obviously a face. Another way of looking at it is to look at these kind of stimuli, which are not obviously faces. So you might see a sort of a patch of blobs and a bowl of fruit in this image. But if I turn it upside down, you'll see that actually you can recognize a face. So this is when it's inverted. If I turn it on its head, it probably immediately pops out to you that actually what we've got there is two faces. Okay? So on the right, we've got a painting by an Italian artist that often made these kind of faces out of fruit and veg. And on the left, we've got what's known as a Mooney face. And that is used actually in a test of one of the sort of principles that we talked about last week to do with perceptual organization. Remember about the principle of closure, about how people are very good at filling in the blanks and sort of linking up different components. You see that as a face, even though there's no outline, there's no contours. It's just blobs of colour, but it's quite striking that you see it as a face. You didn't see it as a face when it was upside down, but when we present those components in that way, we kind of close the edges, we group those elements together, and we see it as a gestalt, right? Remember that term, a gestalt as a kind of a whole holistic image using this sort of gestalt principles of closure. So this maybe gives us a hint to start to think, what is it about faces when they're the right way up that we're doing that makes them particularly special? And one of the things is that we seem to group them together into a whole very readily, and that's what makes it so easy to recognize faces. Okay, so that was the face inversion effect, evidence that something different is happening in faces than in normal objects, or than in other classes of objects. Another effect that shows this kind of thing is the part-whole effect by Tanaka and Farah. So what they did in this experiment was they got people to learn some faces, which people are very good at. So they had some characters, so this is Larry, and they made you learn what Larry looked like. And then at test, you had to do one of two things. You either had to recognize one of Larry's particular features. So I show you two noses, and I say, which is Larry's nose? Or I show you the whole face, and I've just changed the nose, and I say, which is Larry? So it's quite subtle, and this is a line drawing, so it hasn't shown up very well. But those two noses are slightly different. And the test, if you like, in each case is the same. The difference between them is the same. It's all about the nose. The only thing that has changed is the nose. So if all you're doing is looking at the nose, you should be equally good at doing this, because the only thing I've changed is the nose. If all you're doing is looking at the features, you should be equally good. Here are the results. So the bars show what proportion of people got this sort of test correct. And in the white condition, we've got where you were just looking at the feature, which is Larry's nose. And in the black bar, we've got when you were in the whole face. And what they found was that you're much better in the whole face condition, but only in upright faces. So if you're learning upright faces, you were better when you saw the nose, when you saw the feature that's changed in the context of the whole face, than when you just saw the feature. But this effect went away when we turned it upside down. So something is going on again that suggests that we're not just using the individual features, that somehow we're grouping these elements together and we're processing the face as a whole, and that underlies these kind of effects. So recognition was better in the context of a full face than in the context of just individual facial features. So we're binding them together and we're recognizing faces as a whole. So there's another quite nice demonstration of this, and that's the composite effect. Okay? So this is another sort of effect, similar idea, similar principle, an experimental effect where people have done something with faces and shown that something different is going on when we recognize faces. So what Young and colleagues did was they showed people top and bottom halves of people's faces that they had learned, and you had to recognize the top and bottom of people's faces. And they then paired these halves, these face halves, with different people's, with the lower half of different people's faces. So we've taken a particular person, we've put it together with a different face, such as the face in C. And they then gave you a kind of a test where you would see multiple face halves, and you would have to do something like, you'd have to say, is this the same top half of the face in all three of these images that I've paired with different facial halves? And what they found was that people are much worse at doing that kind of test when they're lined up with a different person's chin, with a different person's lower face. So people weren't very good at saying, is that the same top of the face? Is it different top of the face? Is that one I've seen before? Is it not? They weren't very good at that, and they were much better at that if we just showed them the top than if we grouped it together with the bottom. And the idea is that this is the composite effect. The idea is that we can't really help but put these two together. That when I present a top and a bottom half of face, you kind of automatically group them together and you start to see the thing as a whole. So it's much more difficult for you to say, well, actually, that's the same. The top bit is the same. Because you've kind of automatically grouped it into a face. And you're no longer just treating it as eyes and eyebrows and chin. You're treating it as one face. And they found that if you did something like this, where you just kind of didn't align them fully, that effect went away. So now you're okay at recognizing whether it's the same person or not. And if you turn it upside down, you're also much better at recognizing whether it's the same person or not. So again, we've got an effect to do with grouping the features together into a whole, which goes away when we break that by turning it upside down or by sort of skewing the components so that we're less likely to group the features together. So that's the composite effect. Here's another example of the composite effect. We've got two women wearing rather attractive shower caps. This is something which sometimes they do in face experiments to try and exclude all the hair and that kind of thing, so that we're not judging by how well people can recognize hair, we're just looking at the internal features of the face. So here are two sort of examples from an experiment where they did this. But what's not obvious, and what participants found very hard to see, was that actually the top of these faces are exactly the same. They look like completely different people, right? But if I take away the bottom, you'll see that actually the top half of the faces are exactly the same. So they've taken one part of the face and they've merged it with a different bottom half of the face. So when the top half is presented in that context of a full face, it becomes very difficult to sort of see that the top is the same. It becomes difficult to sort of ungroup those elements because, again, it seems like we're automatically putting the features together and processing the face as a whole. Here's one more example of Clinton and Gore. They're quite easily recognizable in that photo because of the hair, because of the sort of the posture and that kind of thing. But what's actually been done in this photo is that the internal features of the face are exactly the same. So Bill and Al's eyes, nose, mouth, all the same. All they've done is they've just put different hair on them. But again, it's hard to see that until it's pointed out to you because it seems like we've automatically grouped it with the external features of the head. So we can start thinking about what is it that's different about faces. We've seen that it's harder to recognize them when they're upside down. And we've seen through these kind of effects that we seem to put the features together into a whole, into a composite, which is kind of automatic. We can't really stop ourselves doing that. Here's one more effect that's been shown to do with faces. We talked about objects. We talked about how we might recognize the objects and some of the stages that we might go through. And one of the stages was just kind of picking out edges, picking out areas of contrast. We can flip the contrast around, turn everything that's dark into light, turn everything that's light into dark. We can do that with a picture of our mate Simon Cowell. And from a sort of a low-level perception point of view, the sort of the features there are exactly the same. The edges are still there, the features are still there. But it's been shown that people are particularly bad at recognizing faces when they're negated like that. So it's much more difficult to see that that's Simon Cowell than it is if I present it with the contrast, the sort of the positive contrast, the way that we're used to seeing it. So this is a bit different, and it shows that something special is going on again. There's some sort of different process that's not just relying on contrast and on contours. It's relying on something else to do with how we're used to seeing this face. It's also been called the Bogart effect from this picture of Humphrey Bogart. And in this experiment, what they showed was that not only do you find it hard to recognize Humphrey Bogart in the negative version, something interesting happens to do with where people think he's looking. So on the left, he's looking over in this direction. But when we reverse the contrast, it looks like he's looking in that direction. So where he's looking tends to flip around when we reverse the contrast polarity of the image. So it has a particularly strong effect on gaze perception. So this is kind of a more specific thing than just faces. It seems to be that as well as being very good at detecting faces, we're very good at knowing where people are looking. Turns out it might be a very important thing for us to do in social circumstances. And again, this is a specialized system which seems to be disrupted when we mess with things like changing the polarity. Perhaps because what we're really doing when we know where somebody's looking is we're looking for the dark bit of the eye and which way it's pointing. Okay, so I've talked about several effects, and I said we should keep in mind about this idea of a functional dissociation. And that's what these effects have shown. So we've shown in the inversion effect, for example, we did a manipulation that affected faces, but it didn't affect other objects, and it didn't affect them to the same degree. So inversion, composite effect, the part-whole effect, all these effects seem to be specific for faces, seem to not happen for control objects, and seem to not happen when we turn the face upside down. They're kind of removed or they go away. So something special is going on, and we can say there's a functional dissociation between the processes that we go through in face recognition as opposed to in object recognition. So faces are disproportionately affected by inversion. Face parts seem to be recognized more easily when they're in the context of a face, and the fusing of these kind of different features into a whole face seems to happen automatically, and when we sort of mess with it in the composite effect, it can disrupt recognition of the specific faces or the specific face parts. And these sorts of findings have been put together to come up with the conclusion that what is special about face processing is that it's holistic or configural. So those two sort of terms are used to describe face perception quite a lot in the literature. Holistic, because we combine them into a whole, we combine them into a gestalt. Face recognition seems to be much more about the whole of the features and how they're arranged, rather than their particular components. So it's not like other objects, not like Marr and Biederman and people that we were talking about last week, where you sort of start with the individual features and you put them together. It seems in faces that the whole is much more important than the sum of the parts. And another way of thinking about it is that it's configural. So what's important in faces is the way that those features are arranged, how far away apart they are, what arrangement they're in, rather than their particular appearance. So face recognition seems to be holistic or configural. Okay, so that was quite a lot of sort of fun effects that show that faces seem to be special, seem to be different from other sorts of objects. And in the next bit, we're going to talk about a kind of a more formal model about how people do what most of us think of as face recognition, which is being able to say, that's Simon Cowell, that's David Hasselhoff, that's Demi Moore, going from a face to a name, recognizing a particular individual. So we're going to talk about a sort of a cognitive model of how we do that, of how we recognize a face. So this is Bruce and Young's 1986 model, and it's quite old, but it's still very influential as a sort of a stereotypical cognitive model, where they've broken down the sorts of processes that we have to go through to recognize a face. So just like when we looked at the structural models of object recognition last week, they've broken down the stages. They've sort of said, what do we do at each stage? What sort of representations of the visual stuff out there do we take? And how do we change those representations in order to get to the sort of the clever behavior that we do in terms of recognizing what we're looking at? So like a lot of sort of cognitive models, it's very sort of boxes and arrows. It's sort of the different stages. And you can sort of read about this and you can look about this in a bit more detail, but I'm just going to emphasize a few things about how the model sort of works. So it starts in the top right-hand corner where it says visual face input. So that's where the visual stuff comes in. We can think about what happens in the retina, what happens in the low-level visual stream, and how that information gets in. And then the model says, well, we kind of encode that in terms of the structure of the face, in terms of the features. And it's a bit sort of agnostic about how that happens. But what's important is that it then splits off into different routes, into different ways that we can use that information. So it has this kind of route, which starts with what it calls view-centered descriptions. And you can think about how we were talking about objects last week, how we were talking about view-dependent and view-independent object recognition models. So when the information comes in, we can think about the current view, what the face looks like at the moment, whether they're wearing sunglasses or not, whether they're happy or not, whether they're talking or not. And we can also think of what they call expression-independent descriptions. So that's, apart from what it looks like right now, how can we derive a sort of a template of that person's face which allows us to recognize that person in all different circumstances, even if we've never seen that person in the dark before or wearing this particular pair of sunglasses. So there are sort of two routes. There's a sort of a view-centered, what's the face doing now route, and there's a generalized route which ends in being able to recognize that person's name, a route for identity. So on the left, we've got things like expression analysis. So if you need to know whether they're happy or sad at a particular point, you need to know what the face looks like now. We've got things like speech analysis. You learned, I think, about the McGurk effect and about how people put together sounds and vision in terms of decoding speech when you were learning about speech recognition. So over there, we've got the kind of stuff that's happening now in the moment. And down here, we've got the generalized representation, which allows us to have a sort of a template, a knowledge of what Demi Moore or Simon Cowell looks like, so that we can recognize them in all different sorts of contexts. So we're going to zoom into that, sort of those stages for a minute. So I've said some of this. I've said that what the model does is it sort of extracts a description of the face, a structural description, which is then either view-centered or view-independent, and about how the current view supports things like expression and speech. But what was more important for Bruce and Young was this other route of how we recognize familiar faces and how we identify them and name them, and how we access all that information that I talked about in the beginning that we know when we look at somebody that we recognize. So we get this kind of generalized view-independent representation of the face, which we can then use to name the person. So zooming in a little bit, these are the next steps after we've got this sort of this generalized representation. What Bruce and Young said was we then go through these sorts of stages. We have something that they called face recognition units. So we have some kind of representation, some kind of template for what that particular individual looks like. And that representation, that face recognition unit, is activated. And that kind of signals to us that this person is familiar. This is somebody we've seen before. So we've got these sort of face recognition units. Perhaps we've got one for each person that we know. And that's activated when the visual information comes in. And this activation is then linked to other stages. So the next stage is what they call pins, person identity nodes. So this links the face to all the stuff that we know about the person. So if I showed you one of those faces, you might say, ah, yes, that's an actor, they were in this film, they're married to X, you know, all this kind of thing that you know about the person. So the semantic information comes in here into the person identity nodes. And what's particularly important for Bruce and Young is that what happens last is we have this kind of name generation process. So the last thing is that we've got a name there. So it's quite sort of abstract. It's quite, you know, maybe a bit far-fetched. But for cognitive models, the point is that it sort of starts to break down the different processes that we have to explain that people do. And it has some predictions about the order in which people do things. So it says, first of all, we get this kind of general feeling that a face is familiar. Then we start thinking about what we know about this person. And what comes last is the name. So what Bruce and Young were trying to account for was the feeling that maybe some of us get sometimes, where we recognise this person but we can't remember their name, or we remember something about them. We know they were in that film, but what's their name? That kind of feeling of familiarity and of being able to access some information but not being able to access the name. So they account for that in this terms of this order of how we process that information. So they provided that kind of evidence in experiments where they've asked people to make decisions, and they've just recorded how long people take to do that. So I could show you a series of faces, and I could say, is this person famous or not? And record how long you take. And that's really fast, right? Familiarity decisions, whether this person is familiar, whether you know this person or not, are fastest. Doing things like matching that person to an occupation. Is this person a politician or a pop star? That judgment takes a bit longer, okay? But it's still faster than actually naming that person. Is this person David Beckham or Simon Cowell? So this kind of supports their order of those stages of what we do with that information when it comes in. And crucially, they said names are never recalled without the stuff that happens earlier. So it's a sort of a feed-forward model, comes in stages. So it's never the case that we can remember that's David Beckham, but we can't remember what he does for a living. It's always the case that, yeah, it's a footballer, I can't remember his name. So it's kind of an asymmetry in the way that that information comes in and it's processed by the cognitive system. So it's an important model to know about. It's provided sort of a lot of discussion and a lot of research in the area of face recognition, but it's also been extended in various ways. So Burton and Bruce and colleagues extended it subsequently using a sort of a connectionist model. So some of you will have heard about connectionist models before in your other courses. Remember, a connectionist model is really just a way of simulating complex processes in a way that maybe is a bit closer to what we actually do in the brain. And it works by linking up different nodes and linking them in a sort of a network, a semantic network, which can be activated in different ways. So they used their sort of interaction-activated competition model to represent the information that they said in their boxes and arrows model was sort of represented and was stored at each stage. So things like the throughs and the pins, remember the face recognition units and the personal identity nodes. So what they said was, again, we have this kind of network of face recognition units which represents that sort of template of David Beckham or Demi Moore, and these are kind of linked in a network to the semantic information, to the pins, to information here, which they call semantic information units. Things like the person's name, that they're a singer, that they're British, what they do for a living. And those sorts of pins are also linked to other stuff, like their actual names. They've got name recognition units there. So the main idea is just that this sort of information is linked in a network, and that the activation spreads through that network gradually. So when we see a face, when a face comes in and we get this activation in the face recognition unit matching that person, the activation spreads through these branches and allows us to get that sort of information about who the person is and what they do and what their name is. And that has some benefits. And the main one is that it can explain what we call semantic priming. So I mentioned priming last week. Priming is just when you get faster to do something the second time round. And in the context of face recognition, semantic priming is when I show you one face and then I show you another face, and you're faster if there's a semantic link between those faces to recognize who that person is. So if I show you a picture of John Lennon, and then I show you a picture of Paul McCartney, you're faster at recognizing Paul than if I had shown you a picture of Bill Clinton and then Paul McCartney. So something about the process that recognizes John Lennon has boosted and made it easier to recognize somebody who's semantically associated with that person. So Burton and colleagues explain that in their model by this idea of activation spreading through the network. So you recognize John Lennon, the face recognition unit for John Lennon's face starts activating, and the activation spreads down. And it spreads down to our personal identity nodes, which is linked to information about John Lennon, linked to information such as he's British, he's a songwriter, and he's a Beatle. The important thing is that that activation then feeds back up to other units which are connected to that information. So that activation feeds back up to Paul McCartney, who is also British, a songwriter and a Beatle. And it means that the resting activation of that unit for Paul McCartney is kind of already a bit excited, right? It's already a bit higher. So next time when you see Paul McCartney, you're quicker because you've already got that sort of boost from the previous trial. Whereas if I did it with something else like Bill Clinton, those same units are not going to have been activated. So the idea of this model is that it can explain things like that. It can explain semantic priming. Here's another example of that. Semantic priming about getting faster, or if I show you somebody's face and then if I show you another person's face who's associated with them, you should be faster at saying who's the second picture if they're related. So you should be faster at recognizing Simon Cowell if I show you Cheryl Cole, than if I showed you David Beckham and then Simon Cowell, because these two are semantically associated. So one of the interesting things with this, and one of the things that we can use as further evidence for their model, is that semantic priming also works if you go name to face. So it's not the case that it only works if I show you a face and then another face. It also works if I just show you a name and then later on I show you the face. So that suggests that what's being primed, what's being boosted, is not something to do with the sort of the features of the face or the actual act of recognizing a face. It's something to do with the semantic information which is connected to that visual stuff. And again, we can explain that by semantic activation and semantic spreading activation in a sort of a network model. So if I show you a name, there's some kind of process in the name recognition units. Show you a name like Cheryl Cole, it sort of activates, that information spreads, and again it's going to raise the activation level, it's going to boost those units that underlie that particular person. And it means that if you see that person later on, you're going to be quicker at recognizing them. So that was one kind of extension to the Bruce and Young, basic Bruce and Young kind of model. It's been revised subsequently in other ways, in lots of different ways. Here's one way that we're going to come back to after the break. Schweinberger and Burton said, okay, we've got these kind of two routes. We've got this route for doing things in the moment to do with expression and to do with speech processing. And we've got this route to do with detecting identity and recognizing a name. But they said, well, there's something else going on as well to do with emotion. So the model looks a bit different here, but it's the same kind of idea. We've got structural encoding coming in, and on the left in those yellow boxes, we've got the stuff that I called view-dependent processing before, the stuff to do with speech analysis and expression analysis. And in the sort of purpley boxes, we've got the route that we looked at before, the FRUs, the face recognition units, and the sort of the information about the person and the semantic information. But what Schweinberger and Burton said is, there's also something sort of emotional that happens, a different route, an emotional route to face recognition, which happens when we kind of feel an emotional attachment to a person. So they said that you kind of get an arousal response to familiar faces, and that this happens kind of independently of whether we know who they are. So you might get that, you might have sometimes had that feeling where you see someone in you can't remember who they are, but you kind of maybe feel familiar about them. There's something under there. There's some sort of emotional response. And that's been confirmed in some experiments where they've shown that even if you can't recognize a face that I showed you in a previous trial, you may show an emotional response. So if I do something like I record your skin conductance, where we record tiny variations in how much you're sweating, like in a lie detector, you kind of show a heightened emotional response to that familiar face, even if you can't actually explicitly recognize it. So there seems to be a sort of emotional route as well. And that's this one extension to the model. Okay, so like I said, Bruce and Young's model has been very influential, and it makes, one of the reasons it's kind of important and it's a good thing to think about at this stage is it makes explicit some differences which are sort of out there and pretty obvious about face recognition between how we recognize a face which is familiar to us, how we sort of distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar faces, and how there's probably something different going on in terms of how we recognize things like facial expression and how we recognize things like identity, which seem to be separate from all the things that we can kind of overcome, like lighting and facial expression at that point and haircut and all these things that actually you can change about a person and people can still recognize them very easily. Okay, so we're going to take a break in a minute. Last week I told you I was going to give you example multiple choice questions, so just to get you sort of thinking about the exam that if you're on PS414 you're going to be taking, and just kind of test your knowledge and test you've been paying attention. Here's one about what we've just been talking about. According to Bruce and Young, face recognition units are used to A, analyze facial expressions, B, process unfamiliar faces, C, help process speech, or D, identify familiar faces. So, a little bit tricky, you know, we've thrown in some other things. Who thinks it's A? Who thinks it's B? Who thinks it's C? Who thinks it's D? Good, you've been listening. Okay, so that's the answer, it's D. So we'll take a quick break. I make it about 10 to, so we'll come back at 3 o'clock and we'll talk a bit more about face recognition.